right? Let's call Jeremiah chapter 2 reason, understanding that much like Isaiah, the first chapter, showed us God basically offering to reason with them in a simple statement. Come, let us reason together. Jeremiah 2 is going to take much the same shape as it starts off with two thus says the Lord statements, one in verse 1 and the other in verse 5. The one in verse 1, simply observing the days in which Israel seemed to follow God in its youth, respectfully, reasonably. However, the second, thus says the Lord, is going to be in verse 5, setting off a series of questions, calling them to reason with God. First one, verse 5. What wrong did your fathers find in me that they went far from me and went after worthlessness and became worthless? Understanding that, he's going to talk about the ways in which, going on through verse 8 or verse 9, they rejected him, then sought to replace him in verses 10 through roughly 13 in a relatively famous question. Has a nation ever replaced or changed its gods? Verse 11. Has a nation changed its gods, even though they are no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. He's going to go on in verse 13 to talk about the way in which they have committed two evils in that regard. One, forsaking God, and hewing out cisterns for themselves, describing himself as the source of living water. Carving out cisterns is basically carving out something that only gives you a temporary limited supply of relief, saying that they are so desperate to find some alternative to God that, once again, as we saw in Isaiah, they're willing to take a cheap, inadequate alternative. Going on, though, in verse 14, he's going to pose another question to them. Really, in my opinion, forming the entire second half of the chapter, where it's going to seem to be that they have fallen into the trap of becoming self-righteous. And it's going to manifest itself in at least two ways. First of all, in verse 14, he's going to say, is Israel a slave? Understanding the way in which, much like we saw in a few chapters toward the beginning of Isaiah, that they were going to Egypt and they were going to Cush to find someone who would support them without regard to their integrity, instead of considering whether or not the things that they were doing were just flat out wrong. In much the same way, Jeremiah sees them years later in the same trap, this time going to Egypt in verse 18 and Assyria for help, justified even more by, in verse 23, kind of going on through the rest of the chapter, describing the way in which they have simply declared themselves righteous without regard to any objective standard. But God is going to contrast their self-righteousness with their actual deeds. In verses 24 through roughly 26, really 24 and 25, talking about the ways in which they have become like a beast. And he's going to compare them to various beasts like donkeys and camels, understanding that regardless of the animal, beast metaphors relate quite a bit to what we seem to see Paul doing in his dog metaphor in Philippians, talking about the ways in which, as people, we are in danger when our God becomes our belly or our appetite. Understanding at that point, our natural humanity begins to give way to beast-like characteristics, and that may be similar to what God is doing here. Why? Because he has already compared them to prostitutes, willing to trade anything in exchange for being able to simply get their way. Or, like he's saying in verses 24 and 25, like animals will pretty much do anything to feed their appetite. It seems to be where Judah has fallen. Going on in verses 26 through roughly 29 to talk about the way in which it is going to only work to their shame, understanding the way in which they shamelessly cling to their idols until they get into enough trouble that they once again remember, oh wait, there was actually the God who led us out of Egypt. And so they will eventually go back to him, calling on him in shame after shamelessly, in verse 30, killing his prophets, and maybe just as much in verse 34, killing the guiltless poor, as the end of verse 34 notices. Yet, in spite of all these things, you say, I am innocent. Surely his anger has turned from me. Behold, I will bring you to judgment for saying, I have not sinned. As verses 36 and 37 go on to talk about the way in which They compound their self-righteousness by their faith in having strong friends. Friends, however, whom God has rejected. Essentially leading them back to the point that God was trying to get them to see all along. The same point he's trying to get us to see. And that is, no matter who our friends are, no matter what our narrative is, are the things that we are doing genuinely rooted in integrity.